By the summer of 1914, Europe's major powers had spent roughly 20 years quietly building alliances, racing to outarm each other, and competing for colonies and prestige, all without a single continent-wide war to show for it. Then, in the space of about 5 weeks, the assassination of one archduke in a city most Europeans couldn't have located on a map dragged almost every major power into a war that would eventually kill somewhere around 17 million people. This video covers the whole thematic study every exam board sets on the causes, course, and ending of the First World War, the alliance system, the arms race, the July crisis, the failure of Germany's war plan, the stalemate on the Western Front, and how the war was finally, exhaustingly won in 1918. We'll move through the assassination at Sarajevo, the Battle of the Somme, the entry of the United States, and the Armistice that ended it all. Let's start with the alliances that turned one regional crisis into a world war. Every exam board structures this topic across roughly the same 3 phases. First, the causes of the war stretching back to 1894, the alliance system, the arms race, imperial rivalry, and repeated crises in the Balkans and Morocco that kept nearly triggering war years before it actually broke out. Second, the course of the war itself from 1914 to 1917, the failure of Germany's Schlieffen Plan, the grinding stalemate of trench warfare on the Western Front, and major battles like Verdun, the Somme, and Passchendaele that consumed enormous numbers of lives for very little ground gained. Third, how the war actually ended between 1917 and 1918, the entry of the United States, Russia's exit from the war, Germany's last major gamble on the battlefield, and the Allied offensive that finally forced an armistice. Keep that shape in mind. Decades of rising tension, years of brutal stalemate, and then a final, fast-moving phase that decided everything. From the 1880s onward, Europe's major powers organized themselves into 2 increasingly rigid blocks of mutual defense. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy formed the Triple Alliance, while France, Russia, and eventually Britain formed the Triple Entente, completed by 1907 once Britain and Russia settled their own long-standing colonial disputes. These alliances were originally meant to deter aggression by making any attack on one country a genuine threat to several others at once. In practice, they created exactly the opposite problem. A relatively small, localized dispute between just 2 countries now carried a real, structural risk of automatically dragging in every other major power in Europe through a chain of existing defensive obligations. Trust between the 2 blocs was already fairly limited, and military planners on both sides had spent years drawing up detailed mobilization plans that assumed a general European war was a real, genuine possibility, not just a distant hypothetical. Smaller regional agreements, like the military convention linking France and Russia since 1894, had actually been forming for 2 decades before the 2 larger blocs fully solidified, showing just how long this underlying diplomatic architecture had genuinely been taking shape. This rigid alliance system is usually identified as the single most important long-term structural cause of how the war eventually spread so completely and so fast. Alongside the alliance system, an increasingly expensive arms race steadily raised tensions across the whole continent. Germany's naval buildup, driven by Kaiser Wilhelm II's personal ambition to rival British sea power, alarmed Britain enormously, since the Royal Navy had underpinned British security and its global empire for generations. In 1906, Britain launched HMS Dreadnought, an entirely new class of battleship so far ahead of anything else afloat that it instantly rendered every existing warship in the world essentially obsolete and triggered a fresh, even more expensive naval race to build still more of them. On land, both France and Germany dramatically expanded the size of their standing armies through the early 1910s, while Russia, still recovering from a humiliating defeat by Japan in 1905, invested heavily in improving and modernizing its own vast military. Military spending across Europe roughly doubled in barely a decade, consuming enormous public resources and encouraging exactly the kind of aggressive, hair-trigger military planning. Popular newspapers on all sides regularly whipped up public excitement over each new ship launched or each fresh army reform, turning what were essentially technical military decisions into matters of intense national pride that politicians then found genuinely difficult to reverse or scale back. All of this made rapid mobilization, once war looked even remotely likely, feel like the safest possible option for every government involved. Competition for colonies and global prestige added yet another serious layer of tension between the major powers, particularly between Germany and France. Germany, a comparatively late and frustrated arrival to overseas empire building, resented Britain and France's existing colonial dominance and actively sought opportunities to challenge it directly and publicly. In 1905, and again in 1911, Germany deliberately provoked diplomatic crises over Morocco specifically to test and probe the strength of the Entente cordiale between Britain and France, hoping to expose weaknesses or drive a wedge between them. Both Moroccan crises ultimately resolved without direct war, but they seriously heightened mutual suspicion, actually pushed Britain and France considerably closer together in response, and demonstrated just how easily colonial rivalry outside Europe could spill over into genuinely dangerous confrontation between the major European powers themselves. These repeated crises also normalized a kind of brinkmanship, showing that European governments were increasingly willing to risk serious international confrontation over comparatively minor, symbolic disputes. Competition also extended well beyond Europe and North Africa itself, with rival powers jockeying for influence and territory across sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia throughout this same period, further layering economic and strategic rivalry on top of the existing alliance tensions. All of this made the eventual actual crisis in 1914 feel less unprecedented than it perhaps should have. The Balkans region, long known at the time as the powder keg of Europe, saw the declining Ottoman Empire steadily lose territory to newly independent, fiercely nationalist states like Serbia, while Austria-Hungary and Russia both competed intensely for influence over the whole region. In 1908, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia, a move that infuriated Serbia, which had its own ambitions to unite South Slavic peoples, including those living inside Bosnia itself, under Serbian leadership. The two Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 further reshuffled territory across the region and left Serbia considerably stronger, more confident, and more assertive than before, which in turn deeply alarmed Austria-Hungary about Serbian influence and ambition right on its own southern border. By 1914, the Balkans had already produced multiple serious international crises in barely 6 years, and Austria-Hungary in particular had grown genuinely convinced that Serbia represented a direct, ongoing existential threat to the unity and stability of its own large, ethnically diverse multinational empire. Russia, meanwhile, saw itself as the natural protector of fellow Slavic, Orthodox Christian peoples across the Balkans, including Serbia specifically, which meant any serious Austro-Hungarian move against Serbia was always likely to draw Russia directly into the resulting confrontation as well. This volatile, unstable region is exactly where the immediate spark that actually triggered the First World War would come from. On the 28th of June, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting Sarajevo, the capital of recently annexed Bosnia, alongside his wife Sophie, when a group of Bosnian Serb nationalists attempted to assassinate him. An initial bomb attack failed, but later that same day, purely by chance, the Archduke's own driver took a wrong turn directly into a street where one of the conspirators, a young nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, happened to still be standing. Princip fired at extremely close range, fatally wounding both Franz Ferdinand and Sophie within minutes of each other. The assassination was quickly and largely accurately traced back to a nationalist group with real, if somewhat murky and disputed, connections to figures inside the Serbian government and military itself. Austria-Hungary saw this as the perfect, long-awaited opportunity to finally crush Serbian nationalism once and for all, using the assassination as direct justification for exactly the kind of decisive military action many senior Austro-Hungarian officials had already wanted to take for years. What could easily have remained a purely regional, localized crisis was about to become something very different indeed. Backed by a firm private promise of German military support, generally known afterward as the blank check, Austria-Hungary issued Serbia a deliberately harsh ultimatum on the 23rd of July, containing demands specifically designed to be almost impossible for any genuinely independent nation to fully accept. Serbia actually agreed to nearly all of the ultimatum's individual demands, but rejected one specific clause that would have allowed Austro-Hungarian officials to personally investigate and operate directly inside Serbian territory itself. Austria-Hungary declared this response insufficient and declared war on Serbia on the 28th of July, exactly 1 month after the assassination itself. From this point onward, the existing alliance system began triggering an extremely rapid, almost mechanical chain reaction. Russia began mobilizing its own military in support of Serbia, Germany declared war on Russia in response, and then declared war on Russia's ally France as well. Crucially, Germany's actual war plan for attacking France required marching directly through neutral Belgium. Germany's own war plan, in other words, effectively guaranteed the exact British intervention it could arguably have avoided by attacking France directly instead. It was that specific violation of Belgian neutrality, a country Britain had formally guaranteed to protect decades earlier, that finally brought Britain into the war on the 4th of August, 1914. When war was actually declared in early August 1914, it was met in most of the major capitals involved with genuine, widespread public enthusiasm rather than any serious dread, with large crowds cheering openly in the streets of Berlin, Paris, London, and Vienna alike. Most political and military leaders across Europe confidently expected a short, comparatively contained conflict, widely predicted at the time to be over well before that same Christmas. Men rushed to volunteer in huge numbers across all the major combatant nations, driven by a heady, genuinely widespread mixture of patriotism, a sense of national duty, and simple fear of somehow missing out on what many assumed would be a brief, glorious, defining adventure. Governments on every side also actively promoted the conflict domestically as a clearly defensive, righteous war forced entirely upon them by aggressive enemies, rather than being honest about their own government's real role in the escalation. This widespread, largely genuine wave of public enthusiasm would look bitterly, tragically misplaced within just a matter of months, once the brutal reality of modern industrial warfare actually became clear to everyone involved. Germany's pre-war strategy, known as the Schlieffen Plan, aimed to avoid a costly war on two separate fronts by rapidly, decisively defeating France through Belgium within about 6 weeks, before pivoting the bulk of German forces east to deal with a presumed slower mobilizing Russia. The plan very nearly worked. German forces advanced rapidly through Belgium and deep into northern France during August 1914, and Paris itself briefly appeared to be in serious, genuine danger of falling. However, tougher than expected Belgian resistance, French and British counterattacks, and simple German logistical strains steadily slowed the advance considerably. At the Battle of the Marne in September 1914, French and British forces successfully halted the German advance only miles from Paris itself, forcing German forces to retreat and dig in defensively along a new, more stable line. Both sides then attempted to outflank each other repeatedly northward in what's often called the race to the sea, but neither side ever achieved a decisive breakthrough. Russia, for its part, actually mobilized considerably faster than German planners had originally anticipated, forcing Germany to divert troops eastward far sooner than the Schlieffen Plan had ever assumed, which further undermined the whole plan's already tight, unforgiving timetable. By the end of 1914, the Schlieffen Plan had definitively failed, and the quick, decisive war almost everyone had originally expected had already become something else entirely. By the start of 1915, both sides had dug an elaborate, continuous system of defensive trenches stretching roughly 475 miles, running all the way from the North Sea coast down to the Swiss border. Between the two opposing trench lines lay no man's land, an exposed strip of shattered, cratered ground defended by dense barbed wire and swept constantly by machine gun fire from both sides. New military technology, including machine guns, heavy artillery, and rapidly improving barbed wire defenses, had decisively shifted the fundamental balance of warfare firmly toward defense, making any large-scale frontal attack across open ground extraordinarily costly for the attacking side. Repeated offensives throughout 1915 and 1916 attempted to break through this deadlock using massive preliminary artillery bombardments, but attacking infantry still had to cross open, heavily defended ground on foot, generally suffering catastrophic casualties for only very small, often quickly reversed territorial gains. This grinding, exhausting stalemate on the Western Front would define the war's popular image for generations afterward. Life inside the trenches themselves was grueling in its own right, involving constant exposure to the elements, disease, rats, and the ever-present threat of snipers and shelling, even during periods without any major offensive underway at all. Understanding exactly why neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough is absolutely central to this whole GCSE topic. In April 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres in Belgium, Germany launched the first large-scale use of poison gas on the Western Front, releasing chlorine gas that drifted slowly across no man's land toward unprepared, completely unprotected French colonial and Canadian troops. The gas caused genuine panic and a significant number of casualties, opening up a real gap in the Allied line, although Germany itself lacked sufficient reserves nearby to immediately, fully exploit the sudden breakthrough it had actually created. Poison gas, in various increasingly lethal forms including chlorine, phosgene, and eventually mustard gas, would go on to be used extensively by both sides for the remainder of the war, though effective gas masks were developed and issued fairly quickly in response, which considerably reduced its effectiveness as a genuinely war-winning weapon over time. Ypres itself, a small but strategically important Belgian town, would be fought over repeatedly throughout the entire war, becoming a grim, recurring symbol of the truly staggering human cost involved in capturing or defending even extremely small amounts of contested territory. Chemical warfare quickly became one of the war's most feared and most enduringly notorious innovations. In 1915, hoping to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war entirely and open a badly needed new supply route directly to Russia, Britain and its allies launched an ambitious amphibious invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula, an idea strongly championed by a young Winston Churchill. Allied troops, including large numbers of Australian and New Zealand soldiers who became known collectively as the Anzacs, landed on Gallipoli's beaches in April 1915, but faced unexpectedly fierce, well-organized Ottoman resistance under the capable command of Mustafa Kemal, who would later found modern Turkey. The invasion quickly bogged down into its own separate, brutal trench stalemate, fought under genuinely harsh, disease-ridden conditions, and after roughly 8 months of extremely costly, largely fruitless fighting, Allied forces were finally, quietly withdrawn at the very end of 1915. The Gallipoli campaign is remembered as a serious, humiliating strategic failure for the Allies, though the Anzac forces' considerable courage and sacrifice there became, and genuinely remains today, a powerful, central part of Australian and New Zealand national identity and memory. It also badly, seriously damaged Churchill's own political reputation for a great many years afterward. In February 1916, Germany launched a massive, sustained offensive against the French fortress town of Verdun, deliberately choosing a location of huge symbolic and strategic importance to France specifically because German commanders correctly calculated the French would defend it absolutely to the very last man available. The German strategy this time wasn't really about capturing territory at all. It was an explicit, calculated strategy of attrition, deliberately designed to inflict such catastrophic, unsustainable casualties on the French army that France's entire ability to keep fighting the war would eventually simply collapse. The resulting battle raged on with terrible, grinding intensity for roughly 10 full months, becoming one of the longest and by far the costliest single battles of the entire war, with combined casualties on both sides eventually reaching somewhere around 700,000 men. France ultimately held Verdun, at absolutely enormous cost, and the battle's now famous rallying cry, "They shall not pass," became a powerful, enduring symbol of French national determination and resilience. Verdun demonstrated with brutal, unmistakable clarity just how genuinely willing both sides now were to accept truly catastrophic casualties rather than simply concede any ground at all. Partly to relieve pressure on the hard-pressed French at Verdun, Britain launched a major offensive along the River Somme in July 1916, preceded by a week-long, massive artillery bombardment that British commanders confidently believed would completely destroy German defenses before the infantry even attacked. It didn't. German trenches were dug deep enough to survive the bombardment largely intact, and when British troops advanced on the 1st of July, they walked directly into devastating, near-continuous machine gun fire. Nearly 20,000 British soldiers were killed on that single opening day alone, making it by a considerable margin the bloodiest single day in the entire history of the British Army. The battle nonetheless continued grinding on for almost 5 more months, and it also saw the first-ever combat use of tanks in September 1916, a genuinely significant new technology, though far too few tanks were available yet, and they remained far too mechanically unreliable to actually deliver any kind of decisive breakthrough at this early stage. By the time the Somme offensive was finally called off in November 1916, combined casualties on both sides had reached well over 1 million men. Many of the dead were from volunteer, PALS battalions, groups of men from the same town or workplace who had enlisted together, meaning entire local communities back in Britain sometimes lost a devastating share of their young men within a single morning. For all this sacrifice, the actual territorial advance achieved was measured in only a very few miles. Beyond the trenches, the war at sea proved genuinely important too, even though direct large-scale naval battles were actually fairly rare throughout the conflict. Britain's Royal Navy imposed a highly effective long-range blockade on Germany, steadily, deliberately restricting food and vital raw material imports, and eventually contributing significantly to serious civilian hardship and malnutrition within Germany itself. In May 1916, the British and German fleets finally clashed directly at the Battle of Jutland, the only major full fleet engagement of the entire war, off the coast of Denmark. Tactically, Germany actually inflicted somewhat heavier losses on the Royal Navy that day, but Britain's fleet remained firmly, decisively in overall control of the North Sea afterward, and Germany's own surface fleet essentially never risked a second major direct confrontation for the rest of the war. Germany instead increasingly turned to submarine warfare, using U-boats to sink Allied and neutral merchant shipping in an effort to starve Britain into submission, a controversial strategy that would eventually carry huge, genuinely fateful diplomatic consequences of its own for Germany, particularly regarding the United States. The Third Battle of Ypres, generally remembered today simply as Passchendaele, ran from July to November 1917 and became infamous even among an already brutal war for its almost uniquely horrific physical conditions. Heavy, sustained shelling had already thoroughly destroyed the local drainage systems across the whole low-lying Flanders battlefield well before the fighting even began, and unusually heavy autumn rainfall then turned the entire battlefield into a churning, near-impassable sea of deep, clinging mud. Soldiers and even artillery pieces and heavily loaded supply wagons frequently became completely stuck or, in some genuinely documented cases, actually drowned in the deep, waterlogged mud itself. Despite these truly appalling conditions, British and Commonwealth forces eventually did capture the small, shattered village of Passchendaele itself in November 1917 at a horrifying combined cost of several 100,000 casualties on both sides. The battle has since become a powerful, enduring shorthand in British popular memory for the apparent sheer futility and horror of trench warfare more broadly, even though historians still actively debate its precise, longer-term strategic value and significance within the wider course of the war. The United States had maintained official neutrality for most of the war, though American public opinion had already shifted considerably against Germany after German U-boats sank the British liner Lusitania in 1915, killing well over 100 American citizens on board. In early 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, deliberately targeting any ships heading toward Britain, including neutral American vessels, in a calculated gamble to starve Britain into surrender before the United States could realistically intervene. Around the very same time, British intelligence intercepted and decoded the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German diplomatic message proposing a military alliance with Mexico against the United States itself if America entered the war. Once this message was made public, American public and political opinion shifted decisively, and the United States formally declared war on Germany in April 1917. Although it took considerable additional time to fully mobilize, train, and transport a genuinely large American army across the Atlantic, the entry of the United States brought Germany's exhausted opponents crucial fresh manpower, substantial industrial resources, and renewed, badly needed strategic confidence at an absolutely critical moment in the war. Russia had suffered catastrophic, sustained military losses and severe internal economic hardship throughout the war, contributing directly and significantly to the Russian Revolution of 1917, which first toppled the Tsar and then, later that same year, brought the Bolsheviks under Lenin to power instead. The new Bolshevik government, having explicitly promised desperate, war-weary Russian citizens an immediate end to the fighting, formally negotiated Russia's complete withdrawal from the war entirely. This withdrawal was formalized through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, an extremely harsh, punitive settlement that forced Russia to surrender huge, economically vital areas of territory, population, and industrial resources directly to Germany. Russia's sudden exit finally freed up a very large number of experienced German troops who had previously been tied down fighting on the Eastern Front, allowing Germany to transfer them rapidly westward for one final, decisive attempt to win the war outright before American reinforcements could fully arrive in truly overwhelming numbers. This dramatic shift set up the last genuinely critical, high-stakes phase of the entire war on the Western Front. In March 1918, German commander Erich Ludendorff launched a massive final gamble, generally known as the Spring Offensive, using newly reinforced troops freed up from the now-closed Eastern Front to attempt one last decisive breakthrough on the Western Front before American forces could fully arrive and tip the overall balance decisively. Using innovative new infiltration tactics involving small, fast-moving specialist assault units known as stormtroopers, German forces initially achieved genuinely dramatic early gains, advancing considerably further and faster than either side had actually managed since way back in 1914. However, German forces steadily outran their own supply lines, suffered heavy, unsustainable casualties among their own most experienced troops, and ultimately failed to actually achieve a fully decisive, war-winning breakthrough despite these early tactical successes. By July 1918, the offensive had completely stalled out, leaving German forces dangerously exposed, badly exhausted, and now considerably more vulnerable than before, just as fresh American troops were finally beginning to arrive in genuinely large, war-changing numbers on the Western Front. Starting in August 1918, Allied forces launched a sustained, coordinated series of offensives, generally known collectively today as the 100 Days Offensive, that finally, decisively broke the long stalemate on the Western Front for good. Allied forces now combined tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry far more effectively and skillfully together than earlier in the war, steadily pushing exhausted German forces back in a series of hard-fought but nonetheless genuinely rapid, sustained advances. German morale, military resources, and overall fighting capacity were all now visibly, seriously collapsing simultaneously, compounded by worsening domestic unrest and outright political turmoil rapidly spreading back home inside Germany itself. Germany's own military leadership eventually concluded that continuing the war any further had become completely hopeless, and formally, urgently advised the German government to seek an immediate armistice before the military situation could deteriorate even further. This final phase of the war moved remarkably fast compared to the years of grinding stalemate that had defined almost the entire conflict up to this exact point. Facing military collapse on the battlefield and serious, escalating revolutionary unrest at home, Germany formally agreed to an armistice, essentially a ceasefire, that came into effect at 11 o'clock in the morning on the 11th of November, 1918. Kaiser Wilhelm II had already abdicated just 2 days earlier, and Germany itself was rapidly, chaotically transitioning toward new, fragile Republican government even as the actual fighting was still finally, formally ending. The armistice was not, technically speaking, a formal, complete peace treaty. It was fundamentally a ceasefire, with a full, final peace settlement still to be properly negotiated among the victorious powers at the Paris Peace Conference the following year. Even so, the fighting itself had genuinely, definitively stopped after 4 years of grinding, industrialist warfare that had killed roughly 17 million people in total and left large parts of northern France and Belgium utterly, physically devastated. The war's actual formal end came astonishingly, dramatically fast in the end, following years of seemingly endless, grinding stalemate that had defined almost the entire conflict beforehand. So, what actually caused the First World War, and how should you weigh up the different factors involved for the exam? Historians generally distinguish carefully between long-term underlying causes, like the alliance system, the arms race, and imperial rivalry, and the specific immediate, short-term trigger, the assassination at Sarajevo, and the July crisis that directly followed it. Neither factor on its own fully, adequately explains the war. The assassination alone was a fairly localized regional crisis that, on its own, needn't necessarily have escalated into a genuinely continent-wide catastrophe, while the long-term tensions alone had, after all, already survived several earlier, comparably serious crises throughout the preceding decade without actually triggering a full-scale war. Top exam answers generally explain clearly how these different long-term and short-term factors actually interacted and reinforced each other. The rigid alliance system turned one regional crisis into a general war, while decades of accumulated arms racing and imperial rivalry had already made European governments genuinely willing to actually risk that kind of war in the first place. This interaction between deep, long-term causes and one specific, immediate trigger is exactly the kind of balanced, structured evaluation exam boards consistently want you to demonstrate directly. So remember the whole arc. Decades of alliance building, arms racing, and colonial rivalry that made a general European war genuinely thinkable, one assassination, and a rigid alliance system that actually turned a regional crisis into exactly that general war. Years of brutal, grinding stalemate on the Western Front, and then a final, fast-moving phase in 1918 where American entry, Russian exit, and one last German gamble decided the eventual outcome. If you remember one thing for the exam, remember that this war had both deep, long-term causes and one specific immediate trigger, and top answers always clearly explain how those two different things actually work together. That's the whole thematic study, in about half an hour. This video is part of our GCSE History playlist, one full topic per video, covering every major exam board in one place. Subscribe for the next one, and good luck in the exam hall.